And as a collaboration model, distributions are different, right? I mean, talk a little bit about what it's like coordinating a distribution, right? I know a little bit about like the Debian ecosystem and package maintainers, and when you want to bring a new package in, and of course they've got all kinds of processes around how they do their intake. They're a very process-oriented group, as I'm sure you know. But I mean, I don't expect, many people in the Rocky community are hacking on the Linux kernel, but correct me if I'm wrong, if that's not the case. Well, where is actual development on software versus doing all of the hard work and all of the reviews and all of the maintenance and tracking of vulnerabilities and bringing in new versions, all the things. Talk about what your ecosystem actually looks like in Rocky and what those people that are volunteering in your ecosystem actually do on a day-to-day basis.
So there's two sides of this. Keep in mind that the whole point of Rocky, the whole goal of Rocky is to make sure that people have a standard as an operating system. Mm-hmm. We've had the choice multiple times if we're going to fork and go in a different direction than enterprise Linux. And I used enterprise Linux terms semi loosely. It's a standard that is currently being maintained by Red Hat, is how I loosely describe it. But it's a standard that is being used pervasively in a lot of places. And but it's also, because it's being maintained by a commercial entity, they kind of own and control that standard, and that's part of their business, their sales process. But being an open standard, it's better for that to be have other implementations. And I do call it a standard. I do think it is an open standard. They don't want, to be clear, I'm not sure if I should say this, but they don't want to have anyone else implementing that open standard. They want to be the only organization implementing that open standard. Rocky's goal is to be a freely available implementation of that open standard. So as much as we can, we actively try not to diverge from Rocky Linux, right? Rocky Linux is following, it is the successor to CentOS. So everything that CentOS brought forth, and all the reasons that CentOS had a lot of users and was supporting those users and use cases, et cetera, Rocky's filling that gap, that hole now. But when we think about operating system development, so Debian is definitely doing operating system development. Like, they're building and kind of managing their own standard of the operating system. And I typically look at it in two areas. You've got your kernel space and you got your user space. Kernel space is literally one package, but it is a gigantic, critical, massive package. And then you've got thousands of other packages that are other open source projects from all over the world. But you can loosely make the categorization of, you got your kernel space and you got your user space. The two you have to manage differently, generally speaking. The kernel space, and the kernel space can get very tricky as well. So we actually just released a white paper, a data sheet on vendor maintained kernels. And the Red Hat does this, but there's a lot more than just Red Hat that has their own vendor kernels. And the idea of a vendor kernel is you take something from kernel.org, you take a snapshot of it, you grab it, and from that moment on, you're kind of working inside of your fork of that. And over time, you may backport lots of things or bring in, cherry pick many things coming from the upstream community. But for the most part, you're owning and controlling that kernel. So we just did a paper, or my team just did a paper. I wish I can claim credit for it, but they're much, much smarter than I am. And then they came up with this, and they realized that when they were reassembling a lot of a particular, you can probably guess which, but a particular vendor kernel, they recognized how many bug fixes were applicable to that kernel, but not imported, not cherry-picked from upstream. Thousands. And if you go talk to many of the kernel developers, every bug in the kernel could be used on a security exploit. So if you consider that, the kernel that most of us are using in enterprise Linux has, and I'll use the bigger number that they found, over 5,000 bugs that are unfixed from upstream. all of a sudden that changes the dynamic considerably in my mind. And I'm actually now nervous, especially now that the kernel has its own CNE. So the kernel's doing their own CVEs. Now, they don't have CVSS scores associated with them, but they're doing their own CVEs for every bug, which means now all of a sudden the entire ecosystem is going to have a ton of CVEs associated with it. And there's almost no way a vendor forked kernel can keep up with upstream. So how are we going to manage this? How are we going to mitigate this? I am a very, very strong proponent that we need to be working much closer with the upstream kernel as the standard kernel. So when we talk about operating system development, and Debian does this to some extent, so does Ubuntu, so does SUSE, so does Oracle. Like, this is how most kernels are maintained. Android is a tremendous example of this. Android kernels they follow a monthly cadence of the stable kernel from Greg Kroah-Hartman and the kernel team. So they are doing it incredibly successfully. Well, depending on your definition of successful, I consider it very successful. And
they're somewhat unique, right? I mean, Android is doing, even Debian, right? You've got unstable if that's where you want to go, but most people stay stable, and that's a much longer time frame, right? And so that's the balance, is the stability versus bugs. And as you say, yes, the kernel folk have become rather adamant that every bug is a potential vulnerability, and then therefore a potential exploit. And so, those are big changes that the kernel community's made just within the last year, as far as really trying to say this. But I understand why you do it, right? You've got that balance of stability. And I think whatever Android is doing to allow for that, it's just, I don't know. It's easier to maintain in mobile. I wouldn't know why, though, as I sit here and think about that. Why? How do they do this? Because that's magic.
I don't think it's easier to maintain in mobile. I think that
I agree.
They have the biggest exploit surface. Android is by far the most utilized operating system now worldwide, by far. So, they recognize that they have to keep this secure, and the best way of keeping it secure is to keep current on the kernel. So I think that's what really drove it.